Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us, and we're going to get started in just a few minutes. We're going to wait for more folks to join, and we're really happy to have all of you with us tonight. Good evening, everyone. We're just going to give it a few more minutes to let folks kind of trickle in here into our webinar Zoom room, and we'll get started in just a couple minutes. Thank you all. Okay, everyone, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all so much for being here this evening. We have a really wonderful program for you. My name is Josh Sherman. I'm the Director of Community Relations for Baltimore Jewish Council. And I just want to thank all of you for joining us this evening to be in conversation with Ari Mittleman, Aston Bright, and Olga Mashu Washington. We're here to talk about Ari's book that has just been released called Paths of the Righteous, Stories of Heroism, Humanity, and Hope. And in this book, Ari highlights 8 individuals who themselves are not Jewish, but who have supported the state of Israel and the Jewish people in very unique ways. And we're really lucky to have both Aston and Olga here with us tonight to be in conversation with Ari and to also share some of their stories. Tonight's event is one that is focused on some of the positives here when thinking about anti-Semitism and how we can come together as a community to fight anti-Semitism. But anti-Semitism has and continues to be a pervasive issue abroad and here in the United States. We have witnessed horrible atrocities and acts of violence against places of worship and the Jewish people over the past couple of months and years here in the United States. And in times of darkness, we must remember to also shine a light on those who are on the front lines fighting against acts of anti-Semitism and working to assist the Jewish people and the state of Israel. And in Ari's book, Paths of the Righteous, Stories of Heroism, Humanity, and Hope, this is exactly what he sets out to do. He has highlighted 8 incredible individuals who have, in their own special ways, gone out in support of the Jewish people and the state of Israel. Ari he works at the nexus of politics and policymaking in Washington, D.C. He is proficient in both modern and biblical Hebrew. He has formally studied the language and traditional Jewish texts since kindergarten and travels regularly to Israel. He has visited over 40 countries and has worked with heads of state, celebrities, and global business leaders. He is native of Pennsylvania and actively involved in the Jewish community. He was very much affected by the tragedy in Pittsburgh at the Tree of Life Synagogue and has moved to highlight these stories in order to uplift individuals who have fought for the Jewish people and the state of Israel. And maybe now my favorite thing about Ari is he is actually now living in Pikesville and is, we're very pleased to have him be a part of the broader Jewish community of Baltimore. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Ari to introduce himself and to tell you more about the program tonight.
Well, I really appreciate that and really appreciate what the Associated and the BJC does each and every day for our community and for the broader Jewish community. There's events scheduled with audiences virtually and in person all around the country around the launch of my book, but I'm especially grateful and was really looking forward to this one tonight because, as was mentioned, this is my adopted community for the last 8 years, and I really think there's really no community in North America like the Baltimore community. So thank you on many levels. Next week actually marks my daughter's 22nd birthday. For some of the audience, that's months, not years, as they know. And even before last month's horrible attack in Texas, my wife and I have been thinking a lot about what America is going to look like for our daughter when she's celebrating her real 21st and 22nd birthday 2 decades from now. What's it going to mean for a young woman with an overtly Hebrew Zionist name growing up in a home that deeply cares about our faith, cares deeply about the U.S.-Israel relationship? These are questions when I was growing up, I was not thinking about. I just always kind of took for granted this incredible country and the world in which we lived. But in short, that's really how this book project began. The truth is I didn't set out to write this book. My wife was in her second trimester when violent anti-Semitic attacks occurred in the most diverse part of our country in December 2019 in the New York tri-state area and Jersey City, in Muncie, and we see to this day, unfortunately, in Brooklyn. And we all know what happened earlier in 2019 and then 18 in my home state of Pennsylvania. The Pittsburgh community is one I know incredibly well. For 8 years, about once a month, I would visit that community for work. And on the last day of Pesach in California, in Poway, California. So it's been a tough time. It's been an emotional time, I'm sure, for each of us joining. And it would have been really easy to be pessimistic and to just wallow in my sadness. But I chose not to. And through sleepless nights, I set out quietly looking for positive stories that were not in depressing headlines and conversations in the back of shul. I looked for a reason to be hopeful as my wife entered her 3rd trimester. And there's probably thousands and thousands of stories like the 8 that I profile. And we're really fortunate to zoom in, so to speak, no pun intended, as we're doing this on Zoom, on 2 of those stories. I think storytelling has really been the antidote for what we have as a Jewish community have done, probably going back to biblical times and then, in the shtetls of Eastern Europe, late into the Shabbos nights. I'm reminded of what President Kennedy famously said, that we're not here to curse the darkness, but to light a candle. And the process of writing this book and now doing these events around the country has really taught me to light that candle, to focus on the positive. And it's something that I try to teach our daughter, who, as folks that have worked with 22-month-old, it's always fun. So we're really lucky tonight to have two of the individuals I profile. For those who've read the book, that'll be, I think, some great perspective. For those who haven't, I don't think that they'll give anything away. The book, by the way, is 8 fast-paced short stories, each less than 5,000 words. So we're going to start with Olga. Olga is joining us from Charlotte, North Carolina, but is originally from Johannesburg, South Africa, a place I visited multiple times professionally. And I really have enjoyed getting to know Olga. She also has young children. But Olga, the floor is yours.
Good evening, everybody that's joined us. Thank you very much to Josh Sherman, as well as the Baltimore Jewish Council. Ari, once again, it is always a pleasure to speak with you. It has been an honor to be profiled on this book. When I ventured out to do what I do, I did not venture out in order to make a name for myself necessarily, and to meet the likes of Aston also, who will be talking to us this evening. That's also been great. So, some details about myself. My mother will tell you that from a little age, I've had a big mouth. And I went to school in South Africa. I studied to become an attorney, was very, very successful in my career, did very well. And I'll never forget that it was 2013 when my father, Reverend Mishra, he came back having been on a tour, a speaking tour in the United States and in Canada. He had been doing quote unquote pro-Israel advocacy work for several years. And he had been asked to come and speak on campuses. And he came home and he was hot and he was agitated and angry. And he called a family meeting and he said, there is this movement called the BDS, and they are spreading this libel saying that Israel is an apartheid state. And we know that that's not true. And if there's going to be a response, there has to be a response primarily from South Africans. So yes, we appreciate responses from across the world, but South Africans have to respond because we know what apartheid was or wasn't, because we experienced it, and especially Black South Africans, because we were those that were directly impacted. We were the oppressed underneath apartheid. And I remember telling my dad, okay, Dad, right, like, you're busy, I'm busy, had my career, doing very well, was not my problem. Mind you, I'm a Christian, and I had grown up in a Christian home, various values such as truth and justice and courage, and even the knowledge and the understanding that there was this country called Israel, and Israel was the home of the Jewish people from biblical times up until the modern era. But despite that knowledge, not my problem. Olga had her career, not my problem. Until Operation Protective Edge, the war with Gaza in 2014. And around that time, as the media was spreading the information that it wanted us to hear and to know about what Israel was doing, one of the things that I'll recall quite vividly is how one of the major newspapers in South Africa had these pictures of what was going on. And there was a poll that was taken after a few months of this reporting, particularly by this newspaper, that found that 8 of the 10 images that were regularly used by this particular newspaper, together with others, were false. They had said that this is what Israel's doing, but these pictures could be traced back to other wars, not even other wars with Israel, but other wars in other nations, but also stills from horror movies. I was like, wait, what? And then there was also in August of 2014, a solidarity rally that was held in Johannesburg, South Africa, where the call was put out for Jews and non-Jews, white people, Black people, Indian people. We have a race, quote unquote, of coloreds, which is very different from South Africa. It's primarily mixed race. And all of these people were called to come and stand together in solidarity with the Jewish people and with Israel in relation to what was going on at the time. And people anticipated small numbers because it was dangerous. And, you know, is the issue that's happening in Israel something that's important to us? And depending on who you ask, 10 to 12,000 people came. It was the most beautiful sight, young and old. And from then on, I started to, as I did my homework and I did my research, because I was asked to speak at that particular rally, I realized that I had an obligation, first of all, as a Christian, but second of all, as somebody who believes in truth, who has a particular love for her continent, but who also has an understanding and an appreciation, and has come to have that understanding and appreciation, which has deepened, as to who the Jewish people are, the gift they are to the world, the gift that Israel is to the world, and that there needed to be a response against what was going on. And so my father founded an organization called DAISY International. DAISY is an acronym that stands for Defend, Embrace, Invest in, and Support Israel. And I now serve as CEO. And Ari, primarily what we do, and to the audience, primarily what we do is we focus on educating young Black South Africans primarily on the truth. What is going on in the Middle East? Who are the Palestinian people? Who are the Jewish people? Why do the Jewish people live where they are? What is the mandate that the Jewish people have? How did this country in 1948 come to be reborn? And I say that emphatically, reborn. We also then teach them the nuances with regards to why people want to appropriate this term apartheid. What does that mean? What does that do for our history? Who is Israel with regards to being a light into the nations? What has Israel's relationship on the African continent been? Were they fruits in relation to that particular relationship? What should we be doing even going forward? And it's important, Ari, because, and I say this with the utmost respect, if you and I were to be on the same platform and somebody were to be like, Israel is an apartheid state, who would have more credibility? As handsome as I believe your wife thinks you are, or me, as Black or as dark, as light-skinned but dark, as my skin color is, people are going to believe me, right? So when the lie is put there, we need to ensure that there are, or rather that there is, this army of young people that are informed with knowledge, that can speak the truth, that can stand courageously and say, not on our watch. As I close my opening remarks, there's a scripture that empowers me, that empowers my family, that empowers our organization, and it's found in the book of Isaiah, chapter 62. And there, Hashem was talking to Isaiah, and he says, I have put watchmen on the wall who will not keep silent. And in the work that I do, speaking, writing, now I have the blessing of being an educator as well as a regional director with a Jewish youth organization here in the United States called Club Z. And I believe that it's an organization that every parent or anybody who knows an 8th grader through to 12th grade needs to be a part of. I have the privilege and the opportunity to continue the conversation, the education with regards to who the Jews are and why standing with Israel is not only an important thing to do, but it is also a vital thing to do for not just the Jewish people, but the prosperity of nations across the world.
Well, Olga, thank you so much. Yeah, Olga and I have had many, many conversations over the last 2 years. We actually have never met in person, but we just learned that the Tucson, Arizona community is going to be hosting us in person. God willing, next month we're going to go down there. But Olga, we've had many personal, professional, geopolitical conversations, and every time I learn something new. So thank you. And particularly, I knew that verse, we would say pasuk from Isaiah, the prophet Yeshayahu, but I did not know that was your guiding light. Actually, as I was working on this book, and as I said, as my wife was pregnant and I was grappling with the rise in anti-Semitism, I set up what we call a chavrusa, a learning partner. And as I kind of thought more and more about this, I turned that famous other verse from Isaiah, I think I turned it on its head, where it says the Jewish people should be a light unto the nations. I said, okay, well, where are our lights? It's a pretty dark time for the Jewish community. Who's illuminating? So speaking about that, I remember my last trip to South Africa was in May of 2018, and I was pulling out of OR Tambo Airport, and there's a big billboard, and it said Israeli Apartheid Week, and it was certainly coinciding with May 1948. It was 2018, so folks can do the math. That was pretty unsettling as I was going off to this quick business trip. Anyhow, I say all that because just last week, a grenade of sorts was thrown by Amnesty International out of London, and you certainly have some strong thoughts on that. So maybe you can share a bit of that with folks in the audience, because I certainly have been curious, and you and I haven't had a chance to catch up since that bombshell dropped.
Yeah, where to start? So unfortunately, people who know Amnesty International's history would know that Amnesty is far gone from being an entity that is impartial, that is just doing the homework and bringing the information to the people. It has got an agenda, and that agenda is unfortunately continuous attacks against Israel. But Ari, what I think is very interesting to observe with non-government organizations, not only with Amnesty International, but also Human Rights Watch. They last year also issued a report calling Israel an apartheid state, is how starting all the way from about 2001, at least for me, in this current trend that we see, is how there have been these nonprofit organizations that have championed human rights, and they're in their championing of human rights have insisted that Israel is an apartheid state. And so we've seen this quote unquote sanitization of the attack against Israel, because it's one thing for companies or other governments across the world who've got political agendas to call Israel an apartheid state, but it's another thing for a nonprofit that supposedly has got no other agenda but to take care of the human rights and to watch out for the human rights of other people to call Israel an apartheid state. People are oftentimes more inclined to believe them. So we've got this quote unquote pure, unbiased organizations that are spreading this libel. So when the report came out last week and I paged through it, and in wearing different hats, I was absolutely appalled. I was appalled as an attorney, as somebody who does research and is an educator and likes to read, as to, first of all, how poorly put together this document was with regards to research. I mean, anybody that does research would know that there are certain basics that you do with regards to gathering your data, putting your data through. It's a mess, but also the application of international law. How the authors of this report literally did, let me not say literally, but in their words, had to do legal gymnastics in order to try and show how the definition of apartheid, as it's put out in international law, actually fits what Israel is doing. But as it speaks to the definition of apartheid, and then as Black South Africans, not only did I continue to be appalled to this because, and maybe let me expound on this for members of the audience who may not be familiar, during apartheid South Africa, which is the birthplace of apartheid, there was no apartheid before then, and there has not been apartheid before then. So if you want to have an understanding of what apartheid is, you need to have an understanding of what happened in South Africa from 1948 all the way up until 1994 when apartheid fell. Black people, no, actually we had 4 categories of people. We had whites and then we had non-whites, and they fell into 3 categories: colored, Africans, and Indians. I was considered an African, and Africans were at the bottom of the food chain. We could not vote. Your restriction in terms of your movement was restricted in the country as a citizen. We were told what we could study because we were seen as racially inferior. And because we were racially inferior, we did not have the capacity to become doctors and engineers. So the education that we received was different. It was dumbed down. We could not use the same public transportation system. We could not go to the same schools. We could not use the same medical, go to the same hospitals. We could not use the same beaches. On and on and on and on and on. I can go with these examples. Now, if you look at Israel, even with her imperfections, Israel is not an apartheid state. People oftentimes will come back to me and be like, okay, but Olga, there's racism in Israel. Yeah, there's racism everywhere. There's racism even in the United States of America. But the fact that there's racism in pockets of society does not mean that that country is an apartheid state. And so what Amnesty International did, and I also saw it in Human Rights Watch, was because Israel does not fit the definition in comparison to South Africa, which is the standard for apartheid, they have gone this route of redefining what apartheid is. So it's a question of, oh, no, it's segregation. And yes, it can't really be segregation on racial terms because we know that that's not true. There's Arabs and there's non-Jews, but it's segregation because there's this intent, right? There was a lot of conversation around intent. So Israel doesn't allow equality of life in this regard, all nonsense. But more egregiously for me was how they redefined apartheid so that Israel would fit into that definition. Because in true comparison to South Africa, it doesn't. Now, if one thinks about it, if you are going to redefine apartheid, if I can use an example, if I'm going to redefine this pen, and we no longer call it a pen, we call it a paper. The question then becomes, first of all, what really is a paper? Because we know that it exists somewhere else. But more sadly is, the pen ceases to exist. So this whole attempt to redefine apartheid, because rightfully so, when you say apartheid, it's charged, right? So people are emotionally angry, and they should not be another nation. There should not be another people in the world that are experiencing apartheid. So they know that it's racially charged. They know that it's emotionally charged. They know that it's politically charged. And so they use this term in order to get people to pursue the agenda that they have, which is ultimately the delegitimization of Israel. And so it should not exist. It needs to cease to exist. But in doing so, not only are they trivializing the pain that Black South Africans really suffered underneath apartheid, they're doing away with our memory, they're doing away with our history, with our experience. And it's a travesty, and it's something that people who love the truth and who know the truth need to continue to stand up and call out.
Olga, thank you again. It just reminds me of the goosebumps I got the first time, I called you out of the blue and said, hey, I'm working on this book project. And, what I'm seeing on YouTube is incredibly inspiring. And I just want to get to know you better. And I think folks in my community should as well. We're going to do one more question. We're then going to pass the baton, so to speak, to my buddy Aston. And then there's certainly questions that are coming up in the chat, and we'll take those. So I don't want to give away the book for those who haven't read, but Olga several years back organized, God bless her, taking a bunch of youngsters to Israel for an intense, essentially birthright version of birthright of Black South Africans. So can you tell folks a little of the highlights of that trip and kind of what was going through your mind as you were boarding that plane with all those young charges in tow?
So I had been to Israel, I think before that trip, only once before. So this trip was a specially designed trip where we were going to be taking these students and student leaders. So if they weren't on university campuses, they had to be leaders within their community. We were going to take them on really an educational trip that was jam-packed, 10 days worth, traveling north, south, east, west of Israel. We even went into the West Bank. And it was supposed to be an experience for them where they could see with their eyes, feel with their hands, have engagements with people as to, okay, let's answer this question. Is Israel an apartheid state or not? What does Israel do? Who is she? Who are her people? What does she look like from a business perspective? What does she look like from a health perspective? I'll never forget, Ari, we land Ben Gurion and we meet our tour guide, and he's a wonderful Jewish man. And then it's time to get onto the bus. Everybody's very excited because now, for the most part, they've heard that Israel is an apartheid state, right? And we know what apartheid means. It means total separation, total segregation. We have this Jewish tour guide. We get on the bus and we are greeted by our Muslim bus driver. And these teens were like, wait, what? Jewish, Arab, Muslim. First of all, this is not apartheid. I'll never forget the experiences of meeting members from the Druze community, and even going into the West Bank when they saw our Jewish tour guide having to get off the bus because he's not allowed. They were like, wait, hang on. This is apartheid? This seems to be a reverse apartheid. Their commentary on the wall. Israel has built this massive wall that is separating the Palestinian people from Israelis. And they were like, oh, this looks like mostly fence. It's 4% wall. And so seeing as they were receiving this information and speaking and asking questions for themselves, as they were having these experiences in the shuk, where there's just this bustling diversity, and going into the factories in the West Bank and asking questions, they came out there going, you know what? Not only is Israel not an apartheid state, she's got so much to offer, and I already have spoken to that. It really was one of the most impactful trips that I've made to Israel, and God willing, I cannot wait to take more students.
I got to ask you one more question, because I'm having, you said shuk, I'm having flashbacks about 30 years ago for my bar mitzvah was my first trip to Israel. And it's one of the only things I can remember that far back. But I just distinctly remember both at the airport and then at the shuk, very large tour groups of folks speaking English in an accent I had never heard. And my father said, oh, these are Black Christian pilgrims from across Africa. And I've since learned, and I've had lots of friends from Nigeria, from Zambia, and some of these folks. And the truth is, and I'm the product of Jewish day school, I mean, these folks know their Old Testament, as they would say, their Tanakh, as we would say, inside and out, literally every, and it's just so remarkable. So I'm just curious, from a young age, you were obviously learning your Bible inside and out. But so if you talk a little about that, and then also just talk a little about the reaction of kind of everyday Israelis and others as this large group of Black South Africans is making their way through the shuk and other sites.
Maybe let me answer your last question first. It was both surprise and curiosity, like, who are you? What are you doing? And then an appreciation for the fact that we had come to see for ourselves. Yes, growing up in a Christian home and somebody who is herself a devout and practicing Christian, I had read the Bible, but Ari, what's interesting is that I've come to find that there are many Christians, there are Zionists at heart, but the connection has not yet been made with regards to this is the land of Israel and these are the people of Israel and why we need to stand with them. So love Israel, we'll pray for Israel, we'll speak up, but the interaction and the connection is something that is not always there and something that we need to work on. But you will find, and I do believe that statistically it's been proven that Christians are amongst the greatest allies of the state of Israel as well as the Jewish people. As a Christian, one of the reasons why I do what I do, not only as a Christian, but as an African, you talk about these Africans taking pilgrimages, is I look at my continent today as a proud African. And I see the challenges that we have and the struggles that we have. And I'm like, okay, there are certain things that we internally need to do, whether it's addressing leaders, addressing issues of corruption, but we also need external help. We need a friend. And there are many countries that are putting up their hands to be our friend, Iran, China. And I'm like, no, we don't want your friendship. But if we don't want their friendship, whose friendship do we need? And so who should Africans become aware of to say, all right, these are going to be our friends, whether we're looking in technology, whether we're looking in health, whether we're looking in business, whatever the case may be. And in my studying, both in the Bible and just general, I came to learn, first of all, that 3,000 years ago, the first diplomatic trade relationship that was had was between an African, and more specifically, a Black African, the Queen of Sheba, and King Solomon. That was the first relationship, the first diplomatic relationship that was had. So as an African, that gets me excited. But then also, when I learn and have learned that in the 1950s and the 1960s, when many African nations were receiving their liberation from colonization and they needed assistance with regards to how do we build for ourselves, our countries, our nations, Ari, the country that had the most number of embassies on the African continent was Israel, despite Israel being a baby. Israel and Israelis and the Jews were on our continent, helping us build our roads, helping us build our hospitals, helping with our security forces. You can go into country after country after country after country and see structures that exist today because of the Jewish people. As a Christian, Genesis 12:3, I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. If you look at a country such as Zambia, who had very close relationships with Israel in the 1950s, 1960s, and the currency of Zambia, which is the kwacha, was equal to the British pound and better than the American dollar, when you look at it today, that's not happening. So when there was this relationship with Israel, where there was a very strong currency, and Zambia is not alone, you look at it today, it's the exact opposite. And so without taking much more time, the 1970s, we had the breaking of the relationships with Israel. And unfortunately, lots of things have deteriorated as a result. I really do believe, many people like to quote the beginning of Genesis 12:3, I will bless those who bless you, but they forget about the latter part, which is I will curse those who curse you. And so there's this responsibility on Africans, number one, who know the Bible, but number two, also who love their continent, to educate and to teach their people as to, we need a friend. Israel has proven herself to be a friend. This is who Israel is. And so this is why we need to work to ensuring that we maintain strong ties with Israel. Maybe let me say this in closing. On Sunday, the heads that are part of the African Union came together because they had a weekend conference. And for those that may not know, Israel, as well as many other nations, including quote unquote Palestine, enjoys observer status on the African Union. And there had been a call by many people that were unhappy with the fact that Israel was given observer status to strip that observer status away from Israel. And thankfully, that was unsuccessful. So more Africans need to know the truth. More Africans need to know who our friend is, so that not only does Israel remain on the African Union, but we are able to continue these strong diplomatic as well as trade and political ties.
Well, thank you again. And I had not stopped and thought about that with King Solomon, but the title of my book, Paths of the Righteous, actually comes from a verse in Proverbs, which our tradition believes that King Solomon wrote many moons ago. We're going to turn it over to Aston Bright, who had a very different experience in Israel, and also has had 2 trips there. And Aston, frankly, really planted the seed, or dare I say, the spark that was the fire of this book. Aston visited the Baltimore community in May of 2019. It was just, as I recall, about 2 weeks after that horrible attack in Poway, California. I was in a pretty dark place. I frankly didn't want to go to the event, but it was an APAC event. And I can never say no to going to an APAC event. Minimally, there's always good sushi and catering. But then this wonderful speaker started talking, and I got off my phone and I said, oh, I'm going to actually stay to the end of the remarks, and it was incredible. So with that, Aston, welcome back virtually 1,000 miles north to the Baltimore community.
Ari, thank you so much. And thank you so much to the Baltimore Jewish Council and Josh for the invitation to be here today. Very excited to be a part of this program and be a part of this amazing book. I play a lot of different roles within my assistance to Israel and the Jewish community. Some know me as a firefighter who's been to Israel to help. Some know me as a friend to the Jewish people. Some know me as a person who's really ready to step in and do whatever needs to be done. Shabbos Goy, whatever you need, I'm your man. And so what I tried to do most importantly in my role in helping is finding where there's a need. And when that call for help comes out, it's important that you answer that call. And I'm going to talk a little bit about my story and sort of how I got involved in this, but I'd like to first talk a little bit about some history. So in May of 1948, when Ben-Gurion made the announcement that the gates of Israel were open and established the state of Israel, it was a very important moment in history because it was the first time in about 2,000 years that Jewish people were able to lead in their own state. So this is important. But even more importantly, 12 minutes later, President Truman acknowledged Israel as a state. And he did that over the objections of his Secretary of State and his Secretary of Defense. They told him not to do it, and he did it anyway. And at that time, and from that moment until today, it established Israel as our most important and best friend and ally in the Middle East. And I say this not just from an academic level. My background is in political science. I studied political and religious conflicts in North Africa and the Middle East. So I understand the academic side of that. But more importantly, the friendship aspect is what I think most people will always talk about when it comes to the state of Israel. But I'd like to say tonight that that thinking is completely wrong because Israel's not our best friend and ally in the Middle East. Israel is our family. Israel's a country that has, through thick and thin, stuck with us, and we have stuck with them, which something that's very unsettling for me is to hear sitting Congress people openly talking negatively about Israel for the first time I've ever seen, which is quite frightening, honestly. And so it's very important that we always try to strengthen that alliance and making sure that everyone knows and understands just how close our two countries really are. And I'm going to share some slides here. One of the most important things I can talk to you about is when the only 9/11 memorial that's outside the United States that has all the names of all the victims inscribed, the only one outside the United States, the only one is in Israel. And the reason why this is important is it really, again, shows that close friendship that the United States and Israel has. And this is actually a picture of me at the 9/11 memorial in Jerusalem. And if you have never been to the 9/11 memorial in Jerusalem, I strongly recommend you go because the camera cannot accurately capture the beauty of this memorial. It overlooks Jerusalem. It's on the side of a big mountain, and it is absolutely spectacular. And I highly recommend everyone to definitely visit this next time you're in Israel. And I'd like to share some fun facts with you. This is very important. There are about 29,747 fire departments in the United States, and only 9% of those are paid departments. So 70% of all firefighters in the US are volunteers. A lot of people don't know that. And there are about 1.1 million firefighters in the US. And in the entire state of Israel, there are only about 2,000 firefighters, only 2,000. So to give you some perspective, that means in the United States, there are about 3 firefighters for every 10,000 people. And in Israel, there are less than 3 firefighters for every 10,000 people. Excuse me, 3 firefighters for every 1,000. And in Israel, there are less than 3 firefighters for every 10,000. So that lets you know that when there is any massive crisis or a war, Israel's resources are used up very, very quickly. And to give you some better perspective, I'm from the city of Plantation, which is just west of Fort Lauderdale. And we have about 100,000 people in our city, and we have 6 fire stations. The city of Jerusalem, the capital of Israel, has 1 million people, and they have 6 fire stations. So when I try to impress upon you the needs that they have when there is a crisis, insofar as protecting and protecting the citizens and fighting fires there, it's pretty significant. And it's really important to know and understand that Israel definitely needs our help. In May to August of 2018, there were over 1,000 fires that were started by kites and balloons coming out of Gaza, going into southern Israel, Ashkelon, Sderot, Netivot, Nahal Oz. It was absolutely devastating. And when these fires happened, that is really when Israel put out that call for help, because their resources were overwhelmed, and they just were calling all hands on deck in order to fight these fires. I got a call on a Wednesday about these fires, and I had recently just joined the EVP, which is the Emergency Volunteers Project, a Jerusalem-based organization that recruits and trains American firefighters to go to Israel to help. And I got a call on that Wednesday when we were alerted about the fires were really overwhelming the resources. By that Sunday, 4 days later, and this picture was taken 4 days later, I was on the Gaza border fighting fires that were coming out of the kites and balloons from Gaza. It was really devastating. I think what is even more insidious about these fires is that there are a lot of Palestinians that live in southern Israel. So even if you're saying, well, we're going to firebomb Israel in order to attack the Jews, well, you're also attacking Palestinians as well. And it just really shows the insanity and the insidiousness of these types of cowardly terrorist attacks that were happening very frequently throughout Israel in the summer of 2018. But if I could just back up for a second, I think it's important for me to talk a little bit about, how did I get involved in this? Like, what was I doing in Israel? Why did I go there? Well, the short answer to that is a gentleman named Michael Yavner. Michael Yavner is one of my best friends. We grew up together. He's Jewish. And most of what I know about Israel and the Jewish people, I learned initially from Michael. And it was, I like to say that Michael is a brother from another mother. I also like to say Michael is Meshpuka. So Michael and I have been very good friends for a long time, but Michael introduced me to a gentleman named Brian Strelitz, who's with the Jewish Federation of Broward. And he told me that, hey, the Jewish Federation is putting together this team of firefighters to go to Israel. Would you be interested in going? And the interesting thing is, I didn't really know what was involved. I had traveled around the world. I had never been to the Middle East, never been to Israel, but without really knowing anything about it, I said, absolutely. I want to get involved. And that's when I first was introduced to Adi Zahavi, who is the executive director of the EVP. And Adi formed the EVP in 2010 in order to respond to the crisis that was happening in Israel, the Mount Carmel fire, and even going back to 2006, the Lebanon war. They found that a lot of the firefighters are also in the IDF. And when there is a war or any sort of intensified conflict, a lot of times the firefighters are called up from reserve duty and have to join the IDF. And it makes it very difficult for them to fight fires, because if there's a war going on in Israel, if there's any sort of national catastrophe, people's homes are still catching on fire. There are car accidents. So there's still routine calls that need to be responded to. And this is one of the reasons why Adi started the EVP. It's a very, very important organization. And one of the most important things about the EVP is they come to the US and they recruit firefighters here in order to go to Israel. And I remember getting the call that there was going to be this meeting. They needed a place to have the meeting. They had no place to have it. And I called my chief and said, hey, there's this organization that's going to send people to Israel. They're having a meeting. They need a place to do it. Can we do it at our department? And our chief's like, yes, absolutely. Let's do it. So we actually hosted the first meeting in Florida, and the fire departments from all around came in. and it was amazing. They had representatives from Israel State Department, Israel Fire and Rescue Services were there. People said they were from some department within the government. I personally think they were Mossad. I don't know, but they came in and gave us political briefings, and they were telling us about the situation in Israel, wanted to make sure that we knew exactly what we're getting into. The most important thing about Israel when we got there is that there was 0 degrees of separation between us and the Israelis. As you can see from this picture, we worked very, very closely with the Israelis, and we lived in the fire stations. We rode on the fire trucks with them. Matter of fact, this is the main fire engine that I was on the entire time I was there. It is an armor-plated, bulletproof fire engine, which I honestly had no idea something like this existed. We were also issued armor-plated vests and ballistic helmets when we reported to duty every day. And the officer on the engine carries a .45 caliber weapon strapped to his side. So firefighting in Israel is a little different. And it is interesting when you're trying to fight fires while under fire from terrorists on your borders and over 200 people who are in your neighborhood trying to drive into the sea. So it's definitely makes it a very, very different and difficult situation. But the ties and the relationship between the United States and Israel are very important. The friendship and the brotherhood is also important. And Israelis are very, what I learned is Israelis are very tough, and because they have to be, just because of the nature of the culture in Israel. And they're also very passionate. I remember I was in the Beersheba fire station one night, and these 2 guys were nose to nose screaming at each other. I mean, they were about to fight. And I ran in to sort of break them up, like, whoa, stop, guys, don't fight. And someone stopped me and said, no, it's okay. They're just trying to decide what we're having for dinner tonight. So, I mean, the Israelis are very passionate, and that passion really comes through. And living in the stations with them, I was there for 14 days. I'd never been on shift for 14 straight days. It was intense. We ran a lot of calls, a lot of fires. Well, the last day I was there, we worked 26 fires the last day. And to give you some perspective, that same year in the city of Plantation, we had 32 fires all year, just to help you understand how incredible of a situation that it was. Most of the fires were that were coming from the kites and balloons were brush fires. And basically what Hamas was doing out of Gaza is they were taking a children's balloon and they were turning it into a weapon. And actually the way that they did it was quite ingenious, honestly. They took refrigeration gas and they filled it up to a certain point, and so it wouldn't just float away and just go up into the sky. And they connected a rubber hose to it and would stuff it with flammable materials, and they would light the coals and things inside the hose. So as the hose is melting and the balloon is flying along, it's not taking off, it's just flying at altitude, the hose is burning and little pieces of ash are dropping off the hose. So one balloon could start 10, 15, 20 fires. And this is what created the significant problem. And that's how they were able to start over 1,000 fires between May and August of 2018, which is pretty amazing. And Shmulik Friedman, who's the regional commander of the South in the Israel Fire and Rescue Service, the very first meeting we had when we got there at one of their main regional centers is he wasn't talking about terrorists. He wasn't talking about fires. He was talking about the birds and the turtles and the trees, and they're trying to burn down this garden that we created. And it really, really impacted me in a way that I probably didn't realize. After a really big fire in the south near Sderot, I actually did a live interview on Israeli television. And this interview that I did, it aired that night. And by the next morning, it had gone viral all over the world. And a lot of people saw it, which is one of the reasons why groups started reaching out to me to come out and speak and advocate for them. But it brings me back to thinking about when people were asking me, well, you know what, why is it that you did this? What would make you want to go to Israel? And by the way, I had to take time off of work. I had to take vacation time in order to do this. But why would you do this and risk your life and be on the Gaza border, and there's snipers and there's all sorts of things going on? You know, why would you do this? And Michael Yavner, my dear friend, is part of that reason. But the main reason why I went and did this was because who was it that helped the Jews 80 years ago? I want you to think about that. Who was it that came to the aid of the Jews 80 years ago? No one. No one came. And that is the reason why when I got the call, that I answered that call and was deployed myself to Israel. And I will continue to fight and advocate for Israel, because Israel is not just our friends, they're our family. And more importantly than that, something I also want you to remember is, I've been to Yad Vashem, I've been to Dhaka, I've seen this evil up close. And I have a duty and an obligation to make sure that I share what I saw and my experiences with the rest of the world, because Israel's not treated fairly in the media. Olga talked about this. And we have to counteract and fight against that. And I am in an ideal situation to do that because, number one, everyone loves firefighters. Number two, I'm not Jewish. And so when I'm saying this, I think it resonates with a lot of people, because if a Jewish person is saying it, then they're saying, well, of course they're going to say this, they're Jewish, but I'm not Jewish. So I'm coming to them from a very neutral position. And I think that what is most important is Didi Schmicki, who is the director of Israel Fire and Rescue Services for the whole country. The whole country, it's a nationalized fire service. They don't have municipal, excuse me, they don't have municipal fire departments. It's a national fire department, almost like an army. And Didi Schmicki, who is the director, one of the things he told us before we left, he said, listen, when you go back to the United States, you must tell everyone about what you saw here. And he wasn't just talking about the shuk and all the great times we had and all the shashuka we ate. The food, by the way, was amazing. But he wanted us to be advocates and ambassadors for Israel. And that's exactly what I've been doing from the minute I got back. I've been speaking for AIPAC, Jewish Federation, JNF. I'll speak anywhere at any time. Hillel's, college campuses. And I've actually been doing a lot of speaking within the Jewish infrastructure and ecosystem. And I'm actually this year, as we're starting to push through COVID, hopefully very soon, I'm going to be speaking on college campuses and a more secular audience. It's actually something, a tour that I'm putting together right now and organizing. So I'm going to really be going into college campuses and trying to do the important work outside of the ecosystem of a more friendly audience into a more hostile environment. But I think that is where most of the work really and truly needs to be done. I do just want to conclude my remarks by saying thank you again to the Baltimore Jewish Council. We really appreciate the opportunity to come here today to talk about this amazing book. And if you don't have this book, many of you do have the book, but if you don't have the book, you must, I got to put in a little plug here. You must go to Amazon and you must buy this book, Paths of the Righteous, Stories of Heroism, Humanity, and Hope. It is a wonderful book by my dear friend Ari. And I'm just looking forward to getting to know you all. And one of my biggest regrets is that I'm not there in person, but hopefully sometime soon I will be there in person so we can shake hands and have a good time and talk a little bit more about some of the wonderful work that the organizations are doing there for the Baltimore community. So thank you.
Well, Aston, thank you. I hope folks in the audience, and it's really honored that we have dozens and dozens of folks tuning in, taking time out of their Tuesday evening. Hope they get a sense. My goal in launching this project, this 2-year book project, was to find these non-Jewish luminaries, to use the metaphor, who are not in the headlines, who are not household names, but really do incredibly inspiring work. And I'd be remiss, last month, Baltimore lost 3 firefighters, and I'm reminded of the Bruce Springsteen verse, may your strength give us strength. It's really incredible what you do day in and day out. Now, without once again giving away part of your chapter in the book, most of your time, as we saw in those slides, which I had never seen. I wish you had shown me those as I was working on your chapter, because the picture says 1,000 words. But anyhow, most of your time was out there in the blazing summer sun on your 2 deployments. And that's a very different type of fire, I learned, to fight a wildfire versus a structure fire. However, there was one structure fire, as I recall, in Sderot, and you thought it was going to be your day off. It was Shabbos, it was the Sabbath, the day of rest, and you learned the concept of pikuach nefesh, to redeem or to save a soul. So if you could share with folks a little about that experience as you thought you were going to be sleeping in on a Saturday.
Are you talking about the synagogue fire?
Yes.
Yes. So so we had we were actually on a big fire that was a little bit to the south, and we got a call that there was a structure fire. We didn't know what type of building, or we didn't know what it was. We just knew it was a structure fire. And so we were dispatched to respond. And in the rush for everyone to sort of shut down what we were doing, shut down the pumps, pack the hose, and get back on the truck, somehow I wound up in like the shotgun seat. So there's a driver driving, and the person next to them is like usually the officer. But because they were so shorthanded, somehow I ended up in that seat. And the officer, whoever's sitting in the officer's seat, is responsible for navigating and, you know, making sure you can get to the fire, get to the address. Okay, so I'm from Fort Lauderdale, I'm from Plantation. I don't know anything about the roads. I can't read the street signs. And the driver is yelling at me to help him get there. And I'm on Google on my phone trying to find it. It was really unbelievable. I still don't know how in the world we got to this fire. I was looking at the smoke and just said, go that way. And we get to this fire. Yeah. And there's a synagogue that's on fire. When we pulled up, there were people frantically trying to get the furniture out of the building. They were removing all the religious textbooks. And it was, as you said, it was Shabbos. And so people, they would have called sooner, but no one wanted to use their phone. And so it got a little bit complicated. And when we got there, and it's actually interesting. So there are 11,000 firefighters in the New York City Fire Department. There are 71 women in the New York City Fire Department. There are 2,000 firefighters in the Israeli Fire and Rescue Services. And there are 6 women in the Israel Fire Department. So by a percentage, there are more women firefighters in Israel than there are in New York City. And I want you to think about that when you think about how women are typically perceived in the Middle East. I mean, in Saudi Arabia, I think they just got the right to drive like 2 years ago. But for Israel to have that kind of a presence with women is pretty amazing. But I mention that because one of those women was actually on that fire, and she was connecting a hydrant right as we were arriving, and was flaking it out and getting ready to grab a line and go in. And it was just truly amazing just to see the heroism of the Israeli firefighters, their professionalism. And we worked on that fire for probably about 2 hours. It took us about an hour or so to put it out. And thankfully, we were able to get everyone out. No one was hurt. There was some damage to the building, but we were able to get in and put that fire out. So it's when you think that you have a plan to dealing with the brush fires and a lot of the smoke, and that was one of the biggest issues with those brush fires. It wasn't necessarily the fire or burn, and a lot of crops were burned and people's livelihoods were affected, but it was the smoke. It was the smoke, especially for children who have respiratory issues. The smoke is incredibly dangerous, and it caused a lot of problems. Several firefighters had to go to the hospital to be treated during that time. But thankfully on that fire, no one was hurt. We were able to get everybody out, and we were able to put the fire out. So it was definitely a touchy situation.
And I don't want to give away the book. I always ask this chapter, but the Sifrei Torahs, the Torah scrolls were all saved.
Yes.
One thing I really enjoyed, and I didn't know when I started this book project, was that even though I've been blessed to have traveled to Israel so many times, I learned so much new. And by the way, not each of the 8 profiles is about Israel. There's individuals who stood up for our community with Holocaust restitution and European anti-Semitism. But I learned something new with each chapter, and I designed the chapters in such a way that even if folks own property in Israel, maybe they've never thought how the Israeli firefighters are organized. So Aston, it was fascinating sitting down with you in one of our interviews, and you went into great detail, and you touched on this a little bit with Mercedes fire engines being up armored. But if you could speak to just the differences, the mechanical differences of how Israelis are putting out fires on much narrower streets and occasionally set by terrorists from what you're doing in suburban Florida.
Yeah, absolutely. So the firefighting in Israel is vastly different. Number one, for every fire call, the police show up, the paramedics show up, the military sometimes will even show up, the IDF will show up. And so it's all hands on deck for every call. And when we had a fire in the post office in Jerusalem, there was a little fire that was in one of the back rooms, and the military blocked off the streets. The police were there, crowd control. But what I thought was interesting was every firefighter who got off of our fire engine, our fire truck, there was an IDF soldier who was like assigned to us and would follow us everywhere we went. And as I said before, the officers on the fire engine are armed. They carry a gun, which is completely different than how we handle things in America. But I thought that was really shocking. And it's interesting because I remember the first time I saw a firefighter with a gun on scene in Israel. And I asked him, I said, well, why do you guys carry guns? And he just looked at me and he just said, terrorists. That was all he said. He just said terrorists. I mean, it's pretty intense. I mean, we in the US, we wear the same gear. They wear the bunker gear to protect us inside of a structure. So that sort of technical aspect is the same, but in Israel, they use much smaller hose lines. They use a lot less water, partially because they have less water is part of the reason. But the second reason is Israel construction is much different than construction in the United States. 99.99% of the buildings in Israel are built of stone or non-flammable materials. So if there's a fire in a structure, then the structure is not on fire, the contents are on fire. So you don't need as much water if you're just trying to put the contents of a house out. So they have very small lines, very, very high pressure. We in the United States, our buildings we have a myriad of different types of building materials. We even have wood framed buildings. And these buildings are like matchboxes. When they ignite, they're going to go up very, very quickly. And so our hose lines typically flow about 160 gallons a minute, which is a lot of water. I want you to think about a gallon of milk and 160 gallons of milk every single minute. It's a lot of water. So number one, you have to have a lot of water, which we do. And number two, you have to have very big hoses and you have to have very big trucks. So our trucks are much larger than their trucks. A lot of the roads in Jerusalem were laid, by the Romans, thousands of years ago. So you can't have the same size equipment. And so the trucks are smaller, the roads are narrower. And it's just completely different. The tactics and things are the same. Ventilation and rescuing and jaws of life, all of that stuff is the same, but it's much, much different insofar as just the equipment that we use. And part of the training when we joined the Emergency Volunteers Project is they actually bring the equipment here to the US so we can get hands-on. We have a day where we're actually doing practical exercises, deploying the hoses, using the equipment. So when we get there, it's just very familiar to us. But firefighting is firefighting. You have to break the fire dehedron. Once you break that chain, the fire is going to go out.
Well, Aston, I'm also curious. Look, maybe I'm biased because I now live in Maryland, but Josh and his colleagues have done incredible work on Black-Jewish relations.
Yes.
And, we're all reminded of the legacy of the late Congressman Elijah Cummings,
Yes.
who represented the city of Baltimore and parts of the suburbs. But let's be honest, those bonds have not been nearly as strong. We just celebrated Dr. King's birthday,
Sure.
and those bonds have weakened over your life and my life. So, I'm curious when whether it's friends in South Florida, folks elsewhere, I'm really eager to go with you to college campuses as we continue the book tour. But what are some thoughts on how we can deepen Black-Jewish relations?
I think the biggest issue, and it's interesting you bring this up at a time when, Whoopi Goldberg is dealing with some issues right now, which is illustrating that some of the challenges that are out there. But I think most of it comes from ignorance. People just don't really know and understand the history. People don't realize that the civil rights movement would have never happened without the support and the relationship with the U.S. And Jewish community. Most of the freedom riders, the Mississippi burning case, 2 of the 3 people were killed, 2 were Jewish. And so there was Martin Luther King worked very closely with the Jewish community. So there's a lot of people just don't know the history. I think that's part of the problem. But I will tell you that, and the work that Olga is doing, I think is absolutely amazing. And we need more education and more outreach and more ways of making a connection. And that's part of the work that I'm trying to do, is try to bridge that gap and just to remind everyone of how deep those bonds are that we have with the Jewish people, that we have with Israel. And that especially when you think about some of those deep-rooted African connections that Olga discussed. So I think things like the Elijah Cummings Youth Program that the Baltimore Jewish Council is doing, and different organizations are trying to bridge that gap, I think are very, very important. But I think it's really going to start with education and understanding. I encourage everyone, everywhere I go, anywhere I go, anyone I talk to, I encourage everyone to go to Israel. I encourage everyone to go there. And part of the reason is because it cuts through all the chaff, it cuts through all the propaganda, all the BDS nonsense, is when you're there, because you can't fake news your way to the reality in Israel unless you go there. And I have had great conversations, long watches with IDF commanders and just talking. And one thing I love about Israelis is they speak their mind. Like I will say, oh, wow, Israelis are so nice. And they're like, oh, well, not to everybody, they're very honest. And when I talk to IDF commanders and they told me, one of them, a major, said something to me that I'll never forget. He said, the thing about the IDF that most people don't understand is it is the Israeli Defense Forces. It's not the Jewish Defense Forces. So the IDF will defend and protect anyone in Israel. So it doesn't matter what religion you are or race you are, it doesn't matter. The IDF is going to protect everyone. And that really landed on me in a way that I don't think most people really understand what is going on in Israel. You go to a place like Akko. I was in Akko in the north, and there was a mosque, a church, and a Jewish temple, all in the same intersection. And you have everyone living together. The people, everyone speaking the Arabic and Hebrew, and they're all talking together and living together. And when you see that, it's quite amazing. But then we'd run a call down into the West Bank, and you realize that there's a lot of work to be done, because we needed a police escort just to go into the West Bank to fight someone's house is on fire, and it was still very dangerous for us to go in there. So there's still a lot of work to be done, Ari, and that's part of the reason why it's very, very important for everyone to stay involved, with great organizations like the Baltimore Jewish Council, the Jewish Federation of Baltimore, and all the organizations that are out there trying to work for social change and trying to cut through some of the ignorance and educate people as to how they can make a difference. And everyone can make a difference in their own way. I like to fight fires. I'm a fireman, so I can go over there and do that. But you may have some other talents, or someone listening in the audience right now may have some other abilities, or you may know someone. And that's why it's important for outreach. Like my friend Michael Yavner, who got me involved in the EVP, that's outreach. He reached outside of the Jewish community to try to pull someone in. I mean, there are only 15, 20 million Jews in the world. Well, there's 7, 8 million in the United States. So it's like, you need to have that outreach. You need to be reaching out, inviting your friends and inviting your family, maybe who aren't even that involved, to get involved in any way that they can. And I think that is very important. If everybody brings one person, then our entire community doubles in size. So I think that's a great way to start.
Austin, thank you. I'm going to hand it back over to our host, Josh Sherman. I believe we have about 20 minutes left, and I'm sure there's audience questions.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, Aston, Olga, and Ari. It's really wonderful to hear your stories. And, I could thank you profusely for coming and joining us this evening, but I think an even bigger thank you for the work that you are doing out in the world and out in the community. And I do see we have a question in the chat from Ellen, and it's for Olga, and it says, Olga, could you compare the reaction you receive to your work on behalf of Israel in the US to reactions you receive on your efforts on behalf of Israel in South Africa? So really just trying to think about the work that you're doing, and what is the reaction that you receive here in the United States versus maybe the reaction that you receive in South Africa?
I'll start with the United States. And Ellen, thank you for your question. I have had the opportunity to speak on very hostile campuses, from Columbia to very friendly campuses, or should I say less hostile campuses. And depending on the protesters that are in the room, I come from a family where there's politicians, and I mentioned the fact that being a Christian, one of the values that I've had to learn is courage. There's been lots of opportunities where it's like, okay, bring it on. I'm ready for a fight, because I have been called a sellout. I have been called a slave to the master. And that's by people who almost seems like there's a cognitive dissonance thing that happens, and that they've heard all of this. But here's somebody who is speaking authentically to the Black experience, the apartheid experience. She has been herself to Israel several times. I loved what Aston said about, actually visiting the place. And so she's speaking from reality, and they don't know what to do with that information. So they either get very, very angry, or they are pleasantly, I don't want to say surprised, they're encouraged, they're hopeful, they're very grateful. I do, though, find that here in the United States, because the whole notion of intersectionality has existed longer, and how the BDS, as well as the anti-Israel groups from Students for Justice in Palestine to, if not now, and various other ones, the Muslim Students Association, have made their cause, or have made the Israel cause their cause, right? So if you were going to stand for racial injustice on a university campus, it has to involve the racist apartheid state of Israel. It has to involve the racist Zionists. And so because they've done a lot of work over the years, I have found that the appreciation exists, but there's still a lot more work to do with regards to, okay, now what? What are the next steps? In South Africa, it has been a little bit easier. One, because I'm talking South African to South African. It's like, okay, like you and I together, or Daisy and you guys together. But also in South Africa, as well as across the African continent, I have thankfully been able to show the personal relationship, even if it may not be personal today, but personal through our ancestry, that Israel and the Jewish people have had with us. It's very, very difficult to walk down a street that was built with Israeli technology, or Israeli help, or look and go into a building where we had this assistance, or we have drought, or we have a medical issue, and there's Israeli technology that's helping us. And so this personal relationship that exists, it's like, okay, guys, on a personal level, these people have done this for us. You've been hearing lies. What have they done for you? How have they changed your lives? How have they impacted you? And so in my experience, I found that the turning is much quicker, but also people who were BDS, because of the lies that they heard out of ignorance, and Aston spoke a little bit to this, because most of them, in my experience, are very they're ignorant. They just want to do the right thing, and they believe that what they're told is the right thing. They are very angry that they've been lied to, that their time has been stolen. So it oftentimes gives me much gratitude when I see the turnaround that happens.
Thank you so much. We have a question in the chat for Aston. This question comes from Wendy, and really the question is pertaining to the current situation in Israel. And if you're aware, how is the firebombing situation in Israel now? And also, I think we'd love to hear, are you thinking about any other opportunities to either visit Israel for pleasure, or if there might be another opportunity for you to go and help out with the fire department once again?
Sure, absolutely. And I have to tell you that actually Wendy McChesney and I are longtime friends. We went to school together. So I've known Wendy since we were in kindergarten. So we've known each other a very long time. And she's a member of the Jewish community in Baltimore. Actually, we went to elementary school, middle school, high school, and college at the University of Florida together. So we've been friends a long time. So we've been friends for about 20 years or so, I guess, whatever. I wish. All right. What's the situation in Israel right now? Well, the one thing Israelis are very good at are countermeasures. So when they were doing a lot of the kites and balloons and all that stuff, Israel developed a very highly advanced drone system that could knock down the drones. I'm talking like hundreds of drones would fly out and knock down the kites and balloons and crash them. So they've been able to really mitigate a lot of a lot of the tactics that they were using. And I think the main reason why the kites and balloons really aren't coming over is because of the Gaza war in 2021. When Israel went in, and I hate to use this term, but it's what it's called, when they went in and mowed the lawn, I think it really eliminated a lot of the issues and the problems that were sprouting up along the Gaza border. Along the Gaza border is extremely dangerous. Israel, the Hamas was taking money that was supposed to be for building hospitals and roads and improving life, and they were building tunnels. With the $90 million they received in aid to build, tens of miles of tunnels, they could have built several hospitals, they could have built schools, provided more resources, and they just squandered a lot of that money. And so I think that one of the most important things that we can always do is make sure that we put pressure on our elected leaders, because a lot of these organizations, and Olga talked about this, are very disingenuous insofar as, aid that's going into Gaza that immediately is weaponized and turned into weapons against Israel. So I think it's very important that we stay on top of our elected leaders. We fight back against sitting members of Congress who are talking negatively openly, out in the open. I'm like, we can hear you, what you're saying. And they're doing it on the open, which is something I could not have ever dreamed I would see. So I think that's important, but the situation right now is much different. And the Israelis are very, very good at dealing with problems. I think I'll try to say that as delicately as I can say that. I will say one thing. We were once fighting a big fire right in there's like a little demilitarized zone between Gaza and Israel. And there's a military base, Nakalaz, which is right there. And they roll tanks through there all times of the day and night. And there was a big fire, really big fire. And we didn't have it under control, but we were all told to take cover behind one of the fire engines, the armor-plated bulletproof fire engines. So we had to drop our hoses, and we were huddled behind this fire engine because there were Hamas snipers spotted by some of the spotters and the drones and whatever. So I'm sitting there, and there's smoke swirling around us, and there's a lot of noise and a lot of activity, tanks rolling around. And I look over to one of my buddies who came over with us, and I was like, this was not in the brochure. I was like, nobody told me I was going to have to take cover behind because they're snipers. So that was one of the moments, and I already talked about this in the book, where I was like, what did I get myself into? That was one of those moments for sure, but it was truly a blessing, and it was just such an amazing experience to be there. When Israelis found out there were Americans in Israel fighting these fires and helping, people came from all over the country. They brought their kids, and they brought food, and they made little arts and crafts. It was just amazing. It was one of the most amazing outpouring activities of support and love I have ever seen. It was really, truly unbelievable. The Israeli people are amazing.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Aston. As we're kind of winding down this evening and hoping to get everyone out of here on time right around 8:30, we've heard a lot tonight from both Aston and Olga and the incredible work that they're doing on behalf of the state of Israel and on behalf of the Jewish people. I would love to have an opportunity for Ari to share a little bit more. And I think I'd be curious, Ari, as well as I'm sure a lot of our other folks on this call. We have Aston and we have Olga here tonight, and they are able to speak for themselves, but wondering if you could share a little bit more about the 6 other individuals that you highlight in your book. And here is another plug, Cows of the Righteous.
Sure. So, I mean, this is like asking a teacher his or her favorite students. They're all incredible. I don't want to I'll be judicious and not go in depth.
I think the chapter about Aston's pretty good.
Yeah. So the order that I choose is by no means there's no discernible order. Look, each of the 8 individuals, certainly Aston and Olga, they impacted me personally very greatly during a difficult time. In addition to the anti-Semitism that I referenced, that our community, unfortunately in Baltimore, is not seen as directly, but elsewhere in the country. Also during this period, I was mourning the loss of my mother. And so in the conversations with these 8 individuals, they gave me their most important resource, their time, and I'll always be grateful for that. I just wanted to put that out there. I'll also say, some in the audience might be more familiar, frankly, than I am, but the Baal Shem Tov, the 18th century Jewish sage, he would often compare light to secrets. So I'd say that the all 8 individuals, and tonight we got an amazing snapshot of 2. They shared their secrets, and they really provided me a light during a difficult and dark time. So the book is 4 men, 4 women. Black, white, and Latina, some from the United States, some from abroad. Why don't we start abroad first? So we've met Olga, amazing snapshot of her incredible work, and I think the best is yet to come. By the way, there's another incredible woman. I'm going to stop saying incredible because everyone's incredible. Who splits her time between Miami and Guatemala, and her family, deeply spiritual. And decided, they came up with a dream, and they said, we want to have the Guatemalan embassy in Jerusalem, the eternal capital of the Jewish state. And as folks will remember, almost immediately after the US moved its embassy, Guatemala followed. So not going to give away that story, but just once again, everyday individual who went above and beyond. Quickly, who else? If folks can learn more, by the way, on the website that the publisher designed for the book, which is just arimittleman.com. Also abroad, we have a medical doctor, an MD PhD from Croatia. This is someone who modeled the entire Croatian education system as it was coming out of a socialism after the Israeli curriculum. In the process, the entire country of Croatia really owned up to really a horrible, atrocious past during the Nazi years. And I think, I obviously can't speak for the Israeli Foreign Ministry, but I think the Israeli Foreign Ministry would say, even publicly, that Croatia is its top ally in the European Union nowadays. Who else? So as we move our way north into the Federal Republic of Germany, as the German Chancellor was just in Washington, an attorney who is really the world leading attorney on Holocaust restitution cases, someone who, with the unification of East and West Germany, gave up an incredibly successful real estate legal career and decided to, and you'll read more in the book, it was completely by happenstance, but decided to really fight the good fight, so to speak, and take up the case. Case is still, even now, just 2 years ago, a case went all the way to the US Supreme Court. Moving west to the British Isles, a former member of the House of Commons, British parliamentarian, who has some very strong opinions about the direction of the Labour Party, her former party. Once again, won't give it away, but really stood up to the bully that I believe, I think many joining us tonight believe, that Jeremy Corbyn is. Going back down across the channel, a Catholic priest, some folks may have seen Father Patrick Dubois on 60 Minutes, and has done incredible work. Stop saying incredible because everyone's done incredible work, and just so inspiring. But meticulously going, starting in Poland, working eastward, over 1 million Jews were executed meticulously on the Eastern Front. He has a term, Holocaust of bullets. And it was just, it was an honor to really sit down and hear him explain how his grandfather brought him, who was a prisoner of war, who had fought for France, really opened his eyes. And rather than having a congregation, this is what this French Catholic priest has devoted his life to. Jumping across the Atlantic, there's a young woman who was born and raised in New Orleans, and now lives in New York, and has done really incredible and innovative work to combat BDS on campus. also a young Black woman. This is going to be very awkward, Josh, if I'm forgetting everyone, but I believe that totals up to 8. But I do hope that folks have begun to read the book, and I'm so grateful that the BJC has lent out the book or purchased the book for the first 100 RSVPs. It was thrilling, by the way, that we crossed 180, which is a great lucky number in Judaism. So I'll just pause there because the hour is getting late. So.
Yes, thank you so much, Ari, and thank you so much, Aston and Olga, and thank you to everyone who tuned in tonight for our webinar. I'm really thankful to have the 3 of you here with us and hear more about your stories and the book, and really just hoping, that we can all find ways to amplify their stories, amplify the work that both Olga and Aston are doing. I think Ari has really gotten ahead of the curve with that in writing this book and sharing it nationally and internationally, and hoping the same for all of us. So just want to thank you all again and express my gratitude, and really excited to see what comes next. Thank you, and have a good night, everyone.